It is impossible to kill ideas with bullets. Every time you visit a conservative think tank where you have to go through a metal detector, you should recognize that basically resources are being forced to be diverted from the mission to security because of left-wing threats. Basically what's happening is that conservatives are being subjected to a speech tax. It's time to take Charlie Kirk as an example of boldness and courage and to lead our lives just as he did, and not to have the kind of defensive and cowering mentality that all too many Americans have been taught to have by the left. Last week, an assassin's bullet took the life of the most effective campus conservative communicator since William F. Buckley Jr. Charlie Kirk was a man of immense talent and also immense courage. He was someone who was courageous not only in risking his life for his beliefs, but also courageous in a simpler moral sense. He was someone who was willing to put his views to the test, someone who was willing to enter into a good faith dialogue with students on campuses across America. He was willing to talk to people who disagreed with him and to work through their differences, to communicate where he was coming from, what his deepest convictions were, what his faith as a Christian told him to say, and what he thought as an individual who had considered the political difficulties of our country. Even in the face of students who had radically different views from his, radically opposed views, Charlie Kirk was always of good cheer and was willing to enter into a dialogue. A gunman took him away. A gunman silenced his voice. But the gunman is not able to silence the discussions that Charlie Kirk began. It is impossible to kill ideas with bullets. But unfortunately, there are other ways to constrain ideas and even to kill them, other ways to silence debate on America's campuses. And the reaction to Charlie Kirk's murder is in danger of doing the very things that the assassin could not do. The danger is that you will have university administrations completing the work of Charlie Kirk's assassin. This happens because of the ideology of safetyism. Hi, I'm Dan McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age, and you can find us online at www.modernAgeJournal.com. We're also in print as one of the most long-lived conservative publications. We were founded in 1957, and every 3 months since then, we have published Modern Age, a journal that was founded by Russell Kirk, the author of The Conservative Mind, back in 1953, in fact. And you will find in the pages of Modern Age and on our website reflective articles that try to present the philosophical side of conservatism and a look at the literature that has informed the mind of the right, rather than simply responding to the immediate headlines of the day. We try to combine a sense of urgency with a sense of real depth for conservatism. Already, in fact, even a decade before Charlie Kirk's assassination, colleges and universities across America were using safety as an excuse for excluding conservative voices from campus. They were claiming that if you wanted to bring a conservative speaker to your school, you would have to pay exorbitant security fees or buy insurance against any kind of protests or violent eruptions while a conservative was visiting your campus. In fact, I actually experienced this myself. So several years ago, a small Catholic college in Texas, a student group at this small Catholic college invited me to come and give a speech about varieties of conservatism. Now, I'm not an extremely well-known speaker. I'm not a firebrand. I'm not nearly as controversial, let alone as famous as Charlie Kirk. And yet the university administration was able to cancel me and to prevent me from speaking by forcing the student group to attempt to pay incredible costs for insurance and for security for this event. This was completely unnecessary. There were no threats being made. There was no indication that there would be any kind of protest, let alone violent ones, on the occasion of my appearance. Instead, this was simply something that the administration did in order to silence a speaker they did not want to hear from. This is something that happens not just to me, not just to figures like Charlie Kirk, but in fact, this is something that is happening across America and has been happening over the course of more than 20 years. There are just an enormous amount of examples of this. Prominent figures, whether it's Ben Shapiro, whether it's Riley Gaines, Andy Ngo, or any number of others, have been canceled not by administrators who, forthrightly and honestly said, we disagree with your viewpoint, we're not going to allow your viewpoint to be heard on campus. Instead, you have administrators who use safetyism as an excuse for the cancellation. They don't even have the courage to simply say, we don't like you, we're not going to permit you to speak. Instead, they use the potential for violence, the threat of violence, as a way to cancel speakers they don't like. Now, think about this. If in fact there really is a danger on a given campus, whose fault is that, and what should the remedy be? If your response to the threat of violence is to blame the people who are threatened, then of course all you're going to do is allow the creation of conditions that will lead to even more threats and will lead basically to the bullies, who are usually on the political left, to be even more bold and even more thorough in their attempts to keep conservatives off campus. Now, this left-wing bullying deserves a little bit of scrutiny here, because what often happens is that these left-wing bullies, some of whom actually threaten violence, they frame their bullying in terms of compassion. So what they actually are doing is committing aggression, but they're doing it disguised as compassion. They're claiming that conservative speakers are a danger to various minority groups on campus. They will claim that it's a danger to students who are racial minorities. They'll claim that it's a danger to transgender persons and others. And they will use this to say that, in fact, conservative speech is actually violence, whereas actual left-wing violence, on the other hand, is simply a defensive measure that's necessary to protect vulnerable populations. Now, university administrators usually don't like to be quite that far left in terms of how they publicly present themselves. They don't like to admit that what they're doing is actually giving in, caving in to radical leftists, militant leftists who are trying to get conservatives canceled. Instead, what is characteristic of all too many college and university administrations is this indirect approach whereby they will say, you know what, we in theory believe in free speech, we in theory believe in having a wide variety of views represented on our campus, but you know what, certain views are simply going to create a ruckus, they're going to lead to protests, they could potentially lead to violence, threats of bombings, even threats of assassination, or in fact, actual assassinations. And therefore, it's simply too expensive to host conservatives on our campus, and if a student group wants to bring a conservative speaker, they're going to have to pay an indemnity, they're going to have to pay insurance. In effect, they will have to pay a tax for having conservative beliefs in order to provide protection from, not from, conservatives who are behaving in a untoward manner. No, that's never the worry. Instead, it's always that there's a threat from the left, or at least the potential or implicit threat from the left. This is a very comprehensive and very effective strategy of censorship. Note that left-wing radicals don't even have to go to the trouble of actually throwing a riot or committing violence. All they have to do is create a climate in which this seems to be something that could potentially erupt at any moment, and very timid, passive administrators will go along with this threat and will give in to those who are making the threat. It is a capitulation that obviously silences conservatives. It silences a number of dissenting voices on our campuses. And this is the kind of pervasive environment that conservative speakers face. One of the great virtues of Charlie Kirk was precisely that he never gave in to that kind of intimidation. And he was facing real threats to his life. And of course, ultimately, his life was taken by an assassin. Charlie Kirk knew that what he was doing was dangerous. He knew that what he was doing was not just creating a little bit of political resistance from the left, but was actually, infuriating both mentally disturbed persons and also people who really had very extreme and violent ideologies, infuriating them to the point where someone might kill him. And also, Charlie Kirk was, he may not have been quite as famous as John Lennon was when John Lennon was assassinated in 1980, but certainly Charlie Kirk was a famous enough individual that there are any number of people who would have liked to kill him just to make themselves famous by the infamy of being responsible for his death. So Charlie Kirk knew that, he was facing not just cancellation based on completely spurious, threats and completely trumped up possibilities of violence, but in Charlie Kirk's case, there actually was real danger. And yet his response to that was not to hide behind, layers and layers of security separating him from students. He did not retreat. He did not stop speaking on campuses. He did not retreat behind a barricade or have, a kind of COVID-era plastic shield around him as he was speaking. No. In fact, even on the day he was killed, Charlie Kirk was very close to students, interacting with them quite directly. He had not only courage, but also integrity. He was bringing his views to people who needed to hear them and people who wanted to hear them. And even if there were people who wanted to silence that conversation, Charlie Kirk was not going to let them do it. all too many conservatives internalize some of the threats that the left makes against them. And they internalize this safetyist culture that administrators on colleges and universities have inculcated in all students and students of all political beliefs. So many conservatives actually are self-intimidated and self-censor. This is true of conservative students who don't speak up about their beliefs because they are afraid that they might be confronted, maybe not violently, but perhaps aggressively, verbally, within the classrooms. I've heard some remarkable stories, by the way, even from Ivy League campuses, and even from courageous professors who are actually traditional liberals who believe in free speech. I've heard some of these professors tell me that within their own classrooms, students self-censor because they fear being confronted in a very aggressive manner by other students. And there's this enormous amount of conformity that the left succeeds in enforcing on America's campuses, even without having to use the actual force of administrations to do it. Instead, they do it through psychological intimidation and through the internalization of this intimidation among their targets. Now, think about the way this affects conservatives. On campuses, it means that conservatives often are unwilling to speak up. It means that conservative student groups, even if they have the courage to bring a speaker, they often may feel a degree of self-censorship because of the financial burden that bringing a speaker presents to them. They may feel, well, look, it's going to be enormously difficult for us to raise the money to provide insurance and security to bring a speaker, or if we try to get into a negotiation with the university to pay for these things, the university is going to hit us with so much bureaucracy, so much red tape, it's just going to be impossible to do. And so in this case, conservatives are discouraged and silenced, not simply through direct ideological intimidation, but rather through the undue burden that is presented to them in the form of security measures, insurance, and red tape. Now, this applies not only on America's college campuses, but off of them as well. Think about how several American conservative think tanks have had to institute security measures such as metal detectors and armed guards at their events and at their headquarters. Now, what effect does this have? How is this, in fact, a very effective assault that the left is making on the right, and that in fact is weakening conservatives even in their own bastions, even in their own think tanks? Well, first of all, obviously, anytime an institution has to pay for security, that's coming out of, resources that would otherwise be used for programming and for advancing the mission. So every time you visit a conservative think tank where you have to go through a metal detector, you should recognize that basically resources are being forced to be diverted from the mission to security because of left-wing threats. So that's a victory for those making the threats. They are succeeding in reducing the amount of financial resources that conservative think tanks have to apply to the things that are most important to them, to their mission, and instead they're forcing conservatives to spend their money on simply trying to maintain their safety. Now, the second thing that this kind of safety culture being imposed on and forced upon conservative institutions does is to deter people from attending programming at these places. So think about it. If you have to go through TSA-style screening every time you want to attend a public lecture at a think tank, you might think, well, this is just too much rigmarole. This is simply a deterrent. I might be interested in hearing a speaker, but on the margins, having to go through a metal detector, having to put up with these kinds of security measures, this is something that's, just on the margins, a greater inconvenience than going and being able to, do something that doesn't require going through a security procedure in order to enjoy. And so you do have on the margins a reduction in interest in attending programming or simply visiting some of these institutions where security has had to be on lockdown because of persistent left-wing threats. So that's a second form of intimidation that really works. On the one hand, there is diverting an institution's resources to having to pay for security rather than advancing the mission. And then there's also the deterrent effect on the public that is exerted by making the public have to go through security procedures in order to attend events at these think tanks and institutions. Finally, and perhaps most insidiously, there is a third kind of intimidation that is highly effective that the left is using against the right here, and that is a psychological form of intimidation. Now think about it. If every day when you go to work you have to pass through metal detectors, you have to undergo various kinds of security clearances, This has the effect of making you feel like a victim. It makes you feel insecure and unsafe. It makes you feel as if you are dependent on something outside of yourself, on other forms of support in order to remain safe. It makes you feel very vulnerable, even if that is a very gradual effect, a very gradual psychological mentality that takes root. It's something that insidiously does indeed, step by step, erode your sense of independence. It erodes your sense of confidence, and instead makes you feel much more vulnerable and dependent. Now, this, of course, is the very core of left-wing mentality in America. Everything from the welfare state to DEI is predicated on the idea that people are weak and vulnerable and need to be protected by experts and by overwhelming external authority. That basically the reason we need to have a vast welfare state, the reason we need to have these DEI programs, the reason why private institutions and private companies have to have HR departments is because people are constantly under threat and everyone is insecure, both economically and also in their personal identity, which might be, targeted for, very aggressive verbal assaults or indeed actual violence at any moment. This, sense of pervasive insecurity, pervasive dependence on experts and outside authorities, this sense of pervasive vulnerability and victimhood is the very core of left-wing thinking in America in the 21st century. It's a mentality that Charlie Kirk lived his life and in fact gave his life in order to fight. And yet it's a mentality that conservatives find being imposed even on themselves by the conditions that the left has created, conditions of trying to make everyone feel insecure and react with the utmost crackdown on, the ability of just normal people, normal students, and in fact normal members of the public to interact with conservatives, whether those are conservative speakers or whether it's conservatives in their own headquarters, in their own institutions in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. It's all about building fences. It's all about making people feel insecure. It's all about making people feel dependent on a security apparatus controlled by experts. And of course, the people who are hiring those experts are often going to be people who have a left-wing understanding of what kinds of potential threats, what kinds of controversial discussions have to be quelled or controlled in order to minimize the risks of even having just ugly incidents, let alone actual violence. So conservatives themselves are besieged here and are under attack, and the spirit of Charlie Kirk was to resist and defy all of those temptations to give in to left-wing intimidation, all of those temptations to say, you know what, we really are insecure, we really are just another victim group, we need to be protected in the same way that the left claims all of its different constituencies have to be protected. Charlie Kirk defied that. Charlie Kirk was willing to risk his very life going out and speaking on hostile college campuses to students who had views that very much were opposite of his. Now, this is not to say, of course, that security is not a genuine concern. I think there certainly are serious questions that have to be asked about how the same scenario that almost cost President Trump his life last year, when an assassin on a rooftop fired on President Trump, who was a candidate, of course, for re-election at that time, and if not for the miracle that President Trump happened to turn his head at just the right moment, the assassin's bullet would not have clipped his ear, but instead would have hit him square in the head. Well, Charlie Kirk was also killed by an assassin on a rooftop, and I think a serious question that has to be asked is why the rooftops of that campus were not being monitored, were not cleared, why there was not a drone keeping an aerial view on what was happening from those elevated positions where a sniper could indeed easily kill someone like Charlie Kirk. So security does matter, but you should not have security as your utmost concern that is going to cause you to censor yourself and be less bold and be something less than a full citizen who enjoys your free speech rights and your rights to communicate with other people, even people who may disagree with you. Basically, what's happening is that conservatives are being subjected to a speech tax through these security measures. And this is something which, of course, has a chilling effect on conservative speech. And it's something that has really been accepted in our country to an unforgivable degree. And it's time to start fighting back. It's time to take Charlie Kirk as an example of boldness and courage and to lead our lives just as he did, and not to have the kind of defensive and cowering mentality that all too many Americans have been taught to have by the left. And by the left, even being able to influence conservatives and making them feel insecure on America's campuses and in their own institutions. Now, I want to conclude by celebrating another aspect of Charlie Kirk's life, and also by criticizing the academic establishment for the way it treated Charlie Kirk and Charlie Kirk's ideas. Now, in one of Charlie Kirk's last books, he happened to include a reading list at the end of the book consisting of many classics of Western civilization. Controversially, he also included a few classics of Russian literature, and many carping, pedantic academics attacked Charlie Kirk and said, hey, you can't call Dostoevsky part of Western civilization because he's Russian. Well, in fact, Russian literature is a very important component of broader Western literature. It's certainly in communication with Western literature and Western civilization in a way that it absolutely belongs in the canon of great works of broadly considered Western literature. But putting aside that minor point, the thing I want to draw most attention to is the fact that you had academics responding to this reading list in the back of Charlie Kirk's book by saying, by basically mocking Charlie Kirk and saying, hey, why would you take a list of classics of the Western canon from Charlie Kirk? And in fact, they even said, look, right here in the pages of the book itself, Charlie Kirk admits that he has not read all of these classics that he is recommending to the readers of his book and to students who are participating in Turning Point USA and to students more generally. Now, isn't that hypocritical? How can you possibly recommend books that you haven't read? Doesn't this show that, in fact, you are a charlatan and a phony, and that only academics who, are qualified to issue reading lists because presumably they've actually read the books? Well, in fact, the opposite is the case. It is commendable that Charlie Kirk recognized that he was not, the most knowledgeable person on the planet. He was not an expert in the Western canon. Nevertheless, he understood as a man of real aspirational learning, a man who really took seriously the idea that, just because he wasn't in college didn't mean that he didn't continue to have a duty to keep learning. And so he recognized that he would listen to the traditional authorities, which had said, here are great works of the Western canon. He recognized that this was a canon that he himself needed to engage with on his own time, on his own terms, in whatever situations he could. That he would have to do that himself, and also that he should pass on this learning that he acquired, this the authority that came with this canon, that he should pass on this treasure that he had received to other people, to those reading his book, and to those participating in Turning Point USA. In other words, what's important here is not just to be able to read all of the works of the Western canon. That's certainly very important, but you have to start somewhere. And the place to start, of course, is with a reading list. You have to start, before you've actually mastered all of these texts. And Charlie Kirk, not only was doing that, but in fact, he had the moral and intellectual courage to do so in a forthright and honest way. Anyone who's involved in the academy, anyone who's involved in the media, comes across an enormous number of frauds, people who claim to have read books they have not in fact read, people who claim to know much more than they in fact know. I think Charlie Kirk not only should not be criticized, but actually should be admired for the fact that he was perfectly willing to say, you know what, I have not read all these things. I know these are good books that should be read. I want to read them myself when I have time, but I haven't been able to do so yet. That's honesty, that's intellectual integrity, and that's a kind of intellectual and moral courage as well. Whereas the academics who are criticizing him, they started criticizing him in 2024, a year before he was assassinated. These academics, first of all, very often are guilty of the very thing, and in fact, guilty of much worse than what they were accusing Charlie Kirk of. In many cases, even academics who have PhDs, who may even have tenured positions, have not read the basic literature of their own field. I certainly know this as someone who has a keen interest in political theory. Now, my own academic background is actually in classics and history. It's not in political theory. However, I've actually read the classics of political theory. I've read something like Hobbes's Leviathan, for example, from end to end, whereas it's notorious, and something that my friend, who actually is a political theory professor, Samuel Goldman, it's something that he points out that, in fact, within the field of political theory, it is notorious that there are not just PhDs, but tenured academics who have only read selections of Hobbes's Leviathan and who think they can teach the book based on selections and then based on kind of a Cliff's Notes knowledge of the rest of the text. And they don't even feel the need to read one of the overall classics of political theory that's written in the English language. We're not talking about a very obscure text. They don't have to master German or Latin in order to read this one in the original language. All they have to do is bring their own ability to read their own native language, English, to going through a book that's about 500 pages in most ordinary editions. This is too much for many political theorists who are teaching your students in the 21st century, and so they are in absolutely no position to criticize someone like Charlie Kirk for recommending, a list of very impressive classics of the Western tradition, broadly understood, simply because Charlie Kirk had not read all these books himself and had not mastered all of them. Charlie, by the way, he really did apply himself in a very systematic way to trying to acquire the knowledge that he didn't have as a younger man. So quite interestingly, he spent 2 hours a day reading many of these classics of Western literature and many of these classics of conservative thought as well. People did not go to Charlie Kirk to hear about political theory. They did not go to him to hear about literature. They didn't go to him to hear about history necessarily. Instead, they were going to him to hear about today's political controversies and about general conflicts between the left and the right. And yet Kirk really devoted himself to, certainly as a Christian, reading a great deal of theology. And in fact, my friend Michael Knowles talks about how very often when he would interact personally with Charlie Kirk, they wouldn't be talking about politics as they were, off the cameras and just, catching up. Instead, they would be talking about theology. So Charlie Kirk took very seriously the intellectual side of his faith, his Christianity. But he also took very seriously the intellectual side of his conservatism. And viewers of the Modern Age podcast are very well aware that Modern Age itself was founded by Russell Kirk, the great author who had written The Conservative Mind back in 1953. Russell Kirk is... Even in his own day, even in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, Russell Kirk was a man who wrote in an elevated style. In fact, in a style that many people, even in the 20th century, considered to be something of a throwback to the 19th century. It's a very elevated and, by today's standards, quite difficult style. And Russell Kirk never talks down to his audience. He's always writing at a very high level. And Russell Kirk, in writing The Conservative Mind, this is a book about the conservative intellectual tradition from Edmund Burke in the late 18th century through to T.S. Eliot and George Santayana, a poet and a philosopher in the early to mid 20th century. Russell Kirk, in writing this book, was not touching on hot-button political topics. It's not a book even about the Cold War and about the politics of the 1950s. It has very little connection to immediate political controversies in the 2020s. Nevertheless, Charlie Kirk, who was no relation to Russell Kirk despite the shared last name, Charlie Kirk recognized that this classic of conservative thought was something that he, as a spokesman for conservatism, should be familiar with and should read, in fact, from cover to cover. So a couple of years ago, Charlie Kirk was indeed reading Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind from start to finish. Now, this, again, is a sign of courage and humility. Charlie Kirk could have, continued to have his career without having to have the slightest knowledge of Russell Kirk, without having to have the slightest knowledge of what Kirk had said in The Conservative Mind. But he felt it was the honest thing to do. He felt it was the thing that had integrity and the thing that actually was true to his convictions as a conservative, to go and read the theory and the literature behind the more immediate, newsy kind of political controversies that Charlie Kirk himself was commenting on. So that speaks very much to what the mission of Modern Age is as well, and the mission of this podcast. We try to connect the controversies of today and these, political incidents that happen in the news from day to day with these deeper currents of thought. And we try to, present an open conversation, a conversation not just for experts, not just for people who are already steeped in the masterworks of conservatism or the Western canon, but a conversation that anyone can join at any moment, from people who have read the entire corpus of Russell Kirk's works to people who have just heard the name Russell Kirk for the first time in this podcast about Charlie Kirk. I just want to end by commending Charlie Kirk's memory and Charlie Kirk's achievements throughout his life as an example to listeners of this podcast, I knew back when Charlie Kirk was starting out that he had many critics, including critics on the right, including critics among conservatives who said, well, he's not the right flavor or variety of conservative for us, or he's too much of a popularizer. He's not actually getting into the deeper intellectual waters of conservatism. Instead, he's just, owning the libs. In fact, I think Charlie Kirk was the person who popularized the term owning the libs. Well, there were people who wanted to dismiss Charlie Kirk on that basis, even, as I say, people on the right, and they were wrong. Because in fact, Charlie Kirk was someone who was greatly dedicated to continuing to dive deeper into the ideas of which he was a profoundly talented spokesman. And he was someone who really had the courage not only to confront hostile audiences on America's campuses, but also someone who had the courage not to be intimidated by academics and experts who said that he simply didn't have the stuff to be able to address their ideas or to address a wide public with, the authority of a Western canon at his back. Instead, Charlie Kirk said, you know what, I'm a journeyman, I have something to learn, I am a sinner, I'm a penitent, I'm starting out, I have so much to do, I have so much to achieve, and I have to, do this openly and in good faith, not only when I talk to students who have ideas that are opposed to mine, but also when I confront, what may seem like a very imposing and very difficult Western canon, or even a canon of American conservatism. It may seem like a reading list is a thing to be intimidated by, but Charlie Kirk recognized it's not something to be intimidated by. It's something to be celebrated. It's something to be embraced, and it's something to be elevated by. And so Charlie Kirk, in life and also in death, was a real hero for American conservatives.